Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to go over chapters 9 through 12 of the Scarlet Letter and kind of look at the analysis of what Hawthorne is doing with these particular chapters and his characters. Now, chapter 9 is entitled The Leech. Now, leech is this old-fashioned term for doctors back from the days when about the only cure that they had for things was to let out your blood. They figured that if you were sick, there was something bad in the blood, and they would either cut it open and drain you a little bit, or they would actually use leeches. So a leech is somebody who, puts a leech on you to draw the bad blood out. Obviously, though, leech also has this incredibly negative connotation. A bloodsucker, something that actually attaches to you and sucks the life right out of you. And if you haven't figured out yet that that's where Hawthorne is going with Chillingworth, then you kind of need to read up a little bit more here. And we learn that Chillingworth has kind of killed his own self. He's created this new persona in the new world, and he's content to let everyone think that Hester's actual husband is, as they all believe, dead someplace at the bottom of the sea. Hawthorne tells us that he withdrew his name from the role of mankind. In other words, he's not even going to have an existence anymore. Now pay attention to that, because Hawthorne is also telling you something about Chillingworth's character, that he's basically not even going to have any humanity left anymore by the end of this book, and said he resolved not to be pilloried beside her in this case is Hester, on her pedestal of shame. And what you get here is a little bit of understandable motivation. I mean, Chillingworth has been gone a long time. He's been captured by Indians, running around in the desert, and just when he comes back and hopes to find a wife and a house and a place to settle in, he sees his bride up there on the scaffold, pregnant, or actually holding the baby from some other guy. And he instead fears now what's described in disease-like terms as this contagion of her dishonor. I mean, Hester is dishonored because of what she did, but Chillingworth would also always be that guy whose wife cheated on him. And that's the term they had for that was cuckolded, that he would know that he had been cheated on, that this would also be shameful. And he says, why would he come forward to an inheritance so little desirable? So he basically disowns Hester and also his old self. Now, the people of the village are actually really glad to have him around. He's this really highly educated doctor. He's been out in the wilderness, so he has all of this sort of native knowledge now about the plants and things. And they're particularly happy because their last doctor was a very religious man, but not all that well trained as a physician. So they're kind of happy to have somebody around who knows what he's doing. And they're particularly pleased to see him take up with Reverend Dimmesdale, because Dimmesdale is this beloved minister, and they worry that if Chillingworth has been out running around with the Indians for too long, that his soul might be in bad shape. So they like seeing him with Dimmesdale as a spiritual advisor. And they actually go so far as to say that he's a miracle that's been brought here to help Reverend Dimmesdale, who's been looking more and more sickly lately. Why else would this guy, who seems to be so highly educated, land in their little village here and stick around? But they say now you constantly see these two together, that wherever the doctor goes out, the minister is with him. And they talk about the village having this fascination for the minister in the company of the man of science. And you're kind of setting up that contrast between the scientific objective and the spiritual religious that we saw in Romanticism so often. Now let's talk a little bit about Dimmesdale being sick. What is going on with him? I mean, today if we saw somebody going through this, we would think that they were going through some sort of cancer or chemotherapy treatment or something. He's described as getting pale. He's very tired all the time. He's weak. He can't move as fast. And he seems to have a pain in his heart. His heart seems to be hurting him, like he's about to have a heart attack over someplace. He's always holding his hand over his heart. Chillingworth starts to get a little suspicious. He says, I think this may be spiritual rather than physical. I can't find anything wrong with you physically that I can tell. So there was this general idea that something that was bothering you spiritually would manifest itself in physical symptoms. So they think Dimmesdale in particular, because he is such a sensitive soul, because his thought and imagination were so active and sensibility so intense, that the bodily infirmity would be likely to have its groundwork there. In other words, there's something wrong in Dimmesdale's soul. And he says, particularly, a little bit of warning from the narrator, a man burdened with a secret should especially avoid the intimacy of his physician. And things start to turn a little bit here at the end of the chapter. Some rumors start. While most of the town still is really, really happy to see Chillingworth there, as time goes by and they see him spending more time together, some things start to happen. First of all, there's this one old guy who says, when I lived back in England, I remember that there was this doctor who was involved with this other kind of murder case, really, and he looked just like this guy Chillingworth. And some other people say, well, he learned most of his medicine from being out there among the heathens, and maybe he's some form of the devil. And Chillingworth himself seems to be a little bit different now that he's living in the same place with Dimmesdale. And Hawthorne tells us that now there was something ugly and evil in his face. Now, he's never been an attractive man. He knows that himself. He told Hester, hey, I'm old and ugly. I shouldn't have married you, but I did. But now we're told that there's something ugly and evil. He looks like he was haunted by Satan himself or was Satan's emissary, like he's been sent here by the devil. But most folks think that, even if it is true, Dimmesdale, this is how much faith they have in Dimmesdale. Dimmesdale is such a powerful minister and is such a spiritual man that he'll win. He'll actually convert Roger Chillingworth and save his soul rather than Chillingworth damaging their beloved minister Dimmesdale. Now, when we get to chapter 10, Chillingworth gets more and more on this idea that there's something hiding in Dimmesdale someplace, that the minister is hiding something. He said, this man, pure as they deem him, all spiritual he seems, but he seems to also have this strong passionate nature, this strong animal nature. And he says, let us dig a little bit farther. And Chillingworth first starts this investigation like a doctor's objectivity. He's sort of doing a workup in a physician, like if you go to the doctors for a checkup, they look in your ear and they listen to your heart and they check on your throat and nose and all of that. And Chillingworth is kind of going through it. And finally he starts saying, I think it's something else. I think it's something inside. And he becomes kind of obsessed with it. He says his purpose is to steal the very treasure which this man guards, that there's something that Dimmesdale is hiding and Chillingworth is going to find out. And again, Hawthorne is not subtle at all about his imagery and these connections he's trying to get you to make. There's lots and lots of connections between secrets and the heart being damaged in some way. And over again, we see this kind of imagery. Black weeds sprung out of a buried heart. That if you keep a secret, it's going to cause your heart pain. But if you confess a secret, confess a guilt, you will get freedom and relief. We're told that hearts holding such miserable secrets will yield them up with joy unspeakable, that hearts all speckled and spotty with the iniquity which they cannot rid themselves. And even Dimmesdale himself talks about all these deathbed confessions. He says, I'm a minister. I've been called in time after time when people were dying, and I've seen them with their dying breath say, I'm so sorry I did this awful thing. Please forgive me. And then they're all relieved and at peace, and he sees them go into the light and go to meet God. And Chillingworth says, I think you need to do this. Your full disclosure is going to be your only cure. He says, a bodily disease may be but a symptom of some ailment in the spiritual part. So keep watching for all of this imagery about hearts, and if you confess the truth about your heart, you'll be free. Now, at the very end of this chapter, they start hearing this child's laughter, and they look outside, and guess what? There's Hester and there's Pearl. And there's this sort of awkward moment where the four of them are all kind of looking at each other. And Chillingworth says, watching Pearl's playing in the graveyard. She's literally dancing on the graves. And she's picking up these little burrs, and she's throwing them at her mom, and she actually outlines them in the shape of the A. She takes out little burrs that, the burrs are those little prickly things that stick to your clothes and to your dog's fur and stuff. And she outlines them in the A, and she's just doing this little devilish child. And Chillingworth says, is there anything good in that kid? Is she just like some little Satan baby or other? And Dimmesdale says that Pearl has the freedom of broken law. In other words, this is classic romanticism, that by not conforming and by being an individual, Pearl has this joy and this freedom that the rest of us don't have. Pearl looks up and sees them, and he calls the minister a black man. And he says, look, Mom, the black man hath got hold of the minister. Now, look at the capitalization here, though, the capital B. He's not saying that he's an African-American. He's saying that black is in, like, Satan was often referred to as the black man. Remember our study of the crucible, they say the black man comes to me at night to sign the book. And Chillingworth asks and says, do you suppose that Hester is actually less miserable than other sinners because of the visible letter A? Because she's admitted, been caught in her sin, she can't hide from it, she has to acknowledge it and deal with it. And Dimmesdale kind of says, yeah, I think she probably is happier. Says it's better for the sufferer to be free to show his pain than to cover it up in his heart. And remember, there's that heart reference again. And Chillingworth is starting to get a little suspicious about what Dimmesdale's secret might actually be. Chillingworth starts saying, dude, I can't help you. I'm your doctor, but you won't tell me everything. How can I possibly diagnose and fix you? And this gets Dimmesdale pretty ticked off. He kicks him out of the house. He says, get out of here. He says, I don't have to tell you anything. I'll never tell everything to an earthly physician. You can't get between me and God. That whatever is wrong with me, whatever my crimes and my sins are that are hidden in my own heart, that's my issue. And I'm not going to tell you anything. And actually kicks Chillingworth out. But it says that soon afterwards they kind of made up and they're back in together. And then there's this cool bit at the end of the chapter where Dimmesdale is falling asleep and Chillingworth kind of sneaks in to kind of watch him to see if there's anything in the way he's sleeping that might give something away, or if he talks in his sleep or something. And as he goes over, he sees something under the minister's shirt and he kind of pulls it back and he sees something. Now, Hawthorne doesn't tell us what. He leaves it there as kind of a cliffhanger at the end of the chapter. But whatever it is, causes Chillingworth to go nuts. He says he has this wild look of rapture, a ghastly wonder, and he starts dancing around the room with joy and up and down this, it says it looks like, Satan being the happiest person on earth dancing around like this. And that's how the chapter ends. So we don't know what it is that Chillingworth saw, but we're getting to the point where we realize that if Chillingworth is happy, it's probably not good for Hester and for Dimmesdale and the other people in the town. Now, chapter 11 is titled The Interior of a Heart. Chillingworth has become convinced now through everything that he has seen and the interactions he had that Dimmesdale is the baby daddy, that Dimmesdale is the guilty one. Dimmesdale is the one that cheated, that stole his wife from him, that slept with another man's wife. And Chillingworth starts to plot his revenge. He says, a more intimate revenge than any mortal had ever wreaked upon an enemy. Because Dimmesdale thinks Chillingworth is a friend. He says all that guilty sorrow hidden from the world to be revealed to him, the pitiless, the unforgiving. And note Hawthorne's use of caps here, like these are titles that you're giving to Chillingworth here. And there's a moment where the narrator said that, the town would have probably pitied and forgiven Dimmesdale because Dimmesdale has such a soft heart and has been doing so many good works in the world that if Dimmesdale had come forward and confessed, they would have been, upset, but they would have forgiven him. But Chillingworth is the last person who's going to forgive Dimmesdale. Now, Hawthorne spent some time in this chapter talking about this contrast that we see in Dimmesdale, the outward Dimmesdale and then the inner Dimmesdale, and by, extension, the contrast that is in all of us. On the outside, Dimmesdale is this beloved minister. The people adore him. Not only adore him, almost this idea that they deem the young clergyman a miracle of holiness, the mouthpiece of heaven, that he's so good at bringing people closer to God. And Hawthorne even implies that he's such a good minister because he is himself suffering, that he has this sensitivity and this compassion that other people respond to. And Dimmesdale hates himself. He even tells the congregation, he doesn't tell them exactly what, but he says, I am a thing altogether vile. I am the worst of sinners. I am an abomination. And you know what? It's kind of like that really pretty girl that stands around in the mirror going, I'm so fat. And everyone around her is like, oh no, you're beautiful. There's nothing wrong with you. That's what they think is going on with Dimmesdale. They think Dimmesdale is in there saying, I'm the worst sinner ever. And they're all going, no, you're wonderful. And he's going, actually, I'm pretty bad. But anyway, Dimmesdale back at home on his own starts in this old practice of what was called self-flagellation. Now, this is the old nuns and monks who would beat themselves up at night, like wear hair shirts, or in this case, in Dimmesdale's case, he's taking this leather strap and he's hitting himself at night, beating himself up with it to punish himself for these crimes. And while he's doing that, he gets these visions. He gets sort of woozy with pain, and he always sees visions of Hester and Pearl at that. And we get this little pithy line from Hawthorne at the end of the chapter: to the untrue man, the whole universe is false. Dimmesdale doesn't even know what to trust anymore because he knows he himself is untrustworthy. Chapter 12 is kind of the turning point of the story. It's called The Minister's Vigil. And this is where we kind of get confirmation on a couple things we've been suspecting for a while. Dimmesdale gets this one idea of something that might help him feel better, that might help to take off some of this guilt. So he decides he's going to do what Hester did. He goes out in the middle of the night. It's a dark night. There's no moon. There's nobody out in the town. And he himself climbs up on the scaffold. And we get this mirror image of the opening scene of the novel. Now, no one sees him out there at nighttime, even though he lets out this cry of anguish, and somebody pokes their head out the window at one point and says, "Do I see somebody down there?" And one of the older ministers walks by right underneath and doesn't even notice him. And what Hawthorne is trying to show you is this is just the same way that they don't actually see the truth about the minister in the daylight either. Except, walking back comes Pearl and Hester, and we learn that the governor is on his deathbed, that a lot of people have been called out to vigil over there, and that Hester was brought in because she's going to have to sew up the clothes that the governor will be buried in. And Pearl immediately notices that that's Dimmesdale up there. And Pearl and Hester climb up on the scaffold with the minister. And Pearl says 3 different times, and this is kind of a reference, a little biblical allusion to Peter, who 3 times refuses to acknowledge that he was one of Christ's disciples. Says, "You will betray me 3 times before the morning." Pearl keeps saying, "Will you stand with us tomorrow in the daylight? Will you meet us back here at noon and climb up here on the scaffold and say that you are part of the family, that you're my father, that you're, in love with my mother?" Dimmesdale says, "Nope. No way." So there's only one day that we're going to stand together as a family, and that will be on Judgment Day. But this world will not see our meeting. And that's when we get the meteor. In this dark, moonless night, this light races across the sky, and people are convinced, kind of like this letter here, this background here, that as the meteor streaks across the sky, it forms the shape of the letter A. And in the light of this meteor, Chillingworth is revealed, standing across the street in this window. And Pearl looks up over at him and says, "Hey, who is that man over there?" And the light from the meteor is kind of contorted, this all red and glow face of Chillingworth. And he says, "I don't even know who that is." And Dimmesdale says, "Do you know who that is? Because that evil man over there, I really hate him." But Hester, remember, was sworn to secrecy at the very beginning, and she keeps the secret. She says, "I have to keep his secret," as she's keeping Dimmesdale's secret. So that's kind of Hester here torn between these 2 guys. Now, the rest of the town thinks that this A was for Angel because this is the night that the governor died. And the town was always interpreting any kind of sign in nature as some sort of symbol or message from God. But they don't know what it stands for. Dimmesdale obviously is convinced that it's a symbol for him to acknowledge that, yes, indeed, he was the other half of this adultery situation. And then the next day, the townspeople find a black glove on the scaffold. Now, Dimmesdale knows that it's his, that he dropped it there, but they all think that it was the devil up there standing maybe at nighttime. Maybe the devil came to try to snatch the governor's soul. But ironically, Dimmesdale turns around and gives this barn burner of a sermon, gives the best sermon he's ever had yet. People are crying and weeping and coming to God and all this kind of stuff. So again, that contrast between the more Dimmesdale seems to suffer internally, the more effective he is as an external preacher. And that brings us to the end of chapter 12 and just leaves us on a little bit of a cliffhanger question. What will Chillingworth do now that he knows that Dimmesdale is the father of Hester's baby? See you next time for the next set.